the skeletal system. Bones and the skeleton, articulation of bones at joints, the scaffolding for the soft tissues of the body. That's what we're discussing in this section. We are looking primarily at bone tissue here, markings, and then in the next section we'll talk about joints and the division of the skeleton itself. I'm also going to start discussing muscles at the same time as bones because they often are pretty closely related. They accomplish very similar tasks for the most part. So I'll introduce muscle tissue when we finish our introduction of bone tissue, and we'll move through the body discussing them both in turn. The skeletal system. We think of it as pretty fixed, right? As far as you can tell, your skeleton has been this way for years. It used to be different. It used to be smaller. And then it became this size and it stopped doing anything. So it must be static, right? That's absolutely not the case. Absolutely not the case. Bones, the skeleton, always remodel, turn over, respond to stress. The best example of that is with astronauts. And the book does a good example highlighting that in the intro. Astronauts can lose 10 to 20% of their bone mineral density depending on how long they're up in space if they aren't using that structure. If they aren't applying gravity, applying a force to that structure. Bone responds to the stress that you place upon it. That's why running, jumping, lots of good physical activity is important for kids whose bones are developing. We want there to be stress in their play habits so that they can develop strong bones. We see this now more and more with inactivity physiology, a new branch of research, not unlike exercise physiology. It's the negative, it's the dark, evil twin of exercise physiology. Inactivity physiology, bed rest studies, very similar responses to astronauts going out into outer space in microgravity. Loss of bone mineral density, frailty, weakness. The skeleton is always remodeling, even if you're fully grown. It's plastic. So we're going to take a look at not so much the remodeling, which is why I spent a bit of time there discussing it. We're looking at growth. We're looking at main characteristics, shapes of bones. The objectives of the chapter as we go through are to use the long bone as a candidate. The long bone, the majority of bones, well, not the majority, the most easily identifiable bone type in the body, the long bone. We'll use that as a candidate to describe structure and function and division of the parts of a bone. We'll compare the two main types of bones, spongy and compact. You've already seen compact in lab, I think lab 1, way back. We know compact bone. You know histology. We'll do a couple recall and review slides on histology, but you know histology, or you should. We'll talk about the processes by which bone forms. Two main processes by which bone forms and grows. And it depends on what kind of bone you're thinking of. Flat bones or long bones undergo one type of ossification or formation. Ossification, is that Latin? It might be Latin for bone growth. I don't actually know. We will then, after we have an understanding of bone tissue, apply it to the skeleton as we know it. We've grossly divided the skeleton in two. The axial and the appendicular skeletons. That'll be a major focus of our next section and of lab coming up next week. Remember, we're back to labs next week. Oh wait, no, that's the skull is next week. And then, yeah, okay. We're getting into it. You will be able to talk about the different shapes of bones and then identify them on sight. This bone looks like it does this job. It's probably in this area. Some will be obvious, like the humerus, the femur, ribs, vertebrae. Some will not be obvious. Cuboidal bones in the hand, some carpals. If you're familiar with them, they might be obvious. We'll also look at markings. So bones we think of just as cylinders or blocks that are hard support structures. We can learn a lot from a bone just by looking at the surface markings. Different surface markings identify the articulation points or connection points of muscle or other organs, or where there's been damage or stress previously. And so those are the main objectives of this chapter. The picture gets more and more eerie the longer you look at it, huh? Bone tissue. Stage 1, bone tissue. What is bone? Bone is an organ. Largely made up of crystallized mineral salts, but also collagen, a lot of water, some adipose, depending on where you are in the bone. Many different tissues that are usually tightly packed and fairly dense. Some areas have a little bit more space than others. But all of those features make up bone as a tissue. And then bone as a tissue, you think of that as the cell, or, well, there are cells within bone, but the constituent of the skeletal system as a whole, the whole skeleton, is the organ system. Each bone has an individual purpose and function, and how it interacts with other bones in the skeleton allows it to achieve a certain task or goal. And we'll go over those goals in depth as we move through the different regions of the body. We'll also highlight the main functions on the next slide, and then we can apply those with specific examples as we get to the regions of the body in question. Fairly tough myriad of tissues to make up the skeleton. Why? What does the skeleton do? There's more than meets the eye. We thought it was static. We realized it remodels all the time, constantly, responds to stress. Obviously, the first task of the skeleton is to provide support. Attachment points for muscles, places for soft organs to hang from or be connected to, or supported by, or contained within. Support. The skeleton is scaffolding of the body. Provides protection. Largely the internal organs, the most important of which we would consider as the brain. We know the brain, we've talked about it in depth. The spinal cord, protected by bone. The heart, which we will talk about. The liver, the intestines, the stomach, the spleen, all protected by bone. Bone's a fairly hard barrier, although it is also flexible, which is really important because it absorbs a lot of impact. It can absorb and recoil and not transmit that impact to the internal tissues. So a big part of its role in protecting is dealing with impacts. So far, this makes it sound fairly static, but of course it's not. The bone assists with body movements in that it allows folding or articulation of various parts of the body, movement in space through articulations, points between two bones that allow movement, joints. We can leverage joints to achieve movement. Now the skeleton can't do that on its own, obviously. We need some other accessory tissue to do that. That accessory tissue can't do it on its own either. Of course, I'm talking about muscle. If you didn't have the skeleton, muscle would just sit there as a blob. You need them both working in tandem. The skeleton provides that structure and framework, the pivot points, and the rigidity to allow movement. What else does it do? The significant majority of the body's calcium is stored in bone. 90+%, 95+%. Major storehouse for calcium in the body. Also phosphate, largely stored in bone. We've heard calcium and phosphate spoken before in lecture. We might even remember where they are, what their roles are. Calcium was a big one. Think synapses. Don't want to ever run out of calcium. And we'll see it's important for other aspects as well of normal physiology. Bone can be a deposit. We use calcium as part of that crystallized matrix to provide rigidity, but we can also release calcium from bone if needed. If we don't have enough in our diets, we resorb bone. We break down bone to release calcium into the bloodstream. It's also the site of red blood cell production. Red blood cell production. We don't know much about red blood cells yet. Something oxygen, something hemoglobin. We'll find out about that next semester. The red blood cells, we take it for granted they're in the blood, they're being circulated, they're produced in the red marrow of bones. They're produced inside bones. Hemopoiesis, the word in brackets on the right, simply means production of blood. Hemo is the prefix for blood. Poiesis is production of. Hemopoiesis, production of blood. Lots of this going on in the developing embryo, still going on in adults, which is great. If you've ever accidentally breathed in some carbon monoxide, or if you're trying to fight off malaria, you want to recycle red blood cells. The large majority of marrow is not red in the adult, though. It's yellow, which is a large storage for triglycerides and fats. A lot of the large central cavity of most long bones is yellow marrow. The red marrow is specifically responsible for making red blood cells, which is near the ends and in some specialized bones that we'll talk about later. So we also store triglycerides in the form of adipose in the yellow marrow, and there's also a little bit of hormone release there as well. Adipose, we're learning just as a tissue in general, isn't only for energy storage, but can release some components that allow different regions to communicate, which is a lot more important with breakage and damage that we're not getting into in depth. So, overall functions of the skeletal system. This is one of your objectives on this slide. Let's talk about bone structure. A little bit of a double entendre with the image on this slide. This is the same image that was on one of the introductory slides. This is the Capela dos Ossos in Portugal, in Évora. I got to go there a couple of years ago. It's a chapel made of bones. Chapel made of bones. And the longer you look at this picture in more detail, the creepier it gets. You see Some sacral bones and many long bones, lots of skulls. Structure of bone. It's a pun. Get it? Many types of bone. We will use the long bone as our primary example, our candidate bone. Long bone is simply the length exceeds the width. Greater length than width. And the long bones are not the most easily identifiable, but some of the most easily identifiable. The humerus, the bone of the upper arm, the femur, bone of the upper leg, tibia, fibula, radius, ulna, many long bones in the body. Clavicle is a long bone. Greater width than length. Short bones, or cuboidal bones, are shown here. A lot of those in the wrist. There are flat bones, which are sheets that generally encase or provide a surface structure. Think the skull. You could argue the scapula, the shoulder blade, is a flat bone as well. Thin layers of bone. There are bones that don't fit into any real category. Irregular bones with many projections, many hollow areas or cavities where the shapes aren't necessarily a cylinder or a cube. The vertebrae are a great example of this. There's a spine, there's a rounded process, there's a hole or a foramen through the middle. And sesamoid bones, which are oddly enough named for sesame seeds. Not cuboidal, not spherical, but shaped like a sesame seed. And the patella or kneecap is a great example of that. Sort of a flattened oval shape. These are our main categories, the main divisions into which you can lump any of the 206 bones in the body. Wouldn't it be great if the final was just 206 questions of which bone is this? No. Talk about a narrow focus, a narrow academic focus. So, structure of bone. Using the long bone as our candidate. Greater length than width. First, diaphysis, the shaft, the long cylinder part, the main portion, the middle portion of the bone, called the diaphysis. You can see that highlighted here on the left. Diaphysis in the middle. The epiphyses, one epiphysis, two epiphyses are the ends, the distal and proximal ends of a long bone. And they are connected by the metaphyses. Meta in the middle. One metaphysis, two metaphyses, one on each end of the diaphysis, and then the epiphyses encapsulating the whole thing. So while the diaphysis gives the shape and the overall structure to the bone, the epiphyses are the points of connection or articulation, the points of contact. Where one bone abuts another. The end of the bone that articulate with adjacent bones. Those are the epiphyses. The metaphyses don't seem like much at first. They're just sandwiched between the main structure and then the articulating surfaces. But this is the major site of bone growth in the developing body. The metaphyses include, you can't see them here because this is an example of an adult bone, but the epiphyseal plates are something that we'll come back to shortly. The epiphyseal plates are the site of bone growth. And when bone growth stops, when you mature, that site converts into bone, and you can see that highlighted here as the epiphyseal line. This is a non-elongating adult bone where the epiphyseal plate has been ossified, has become bone itself. But until that point in the developing embryo, the epiphyseal line is the site of the epiphyseal plate, which is the major site of bone growth. We also have articular cartilage. You can see that on the very ends lining the epiphyses. The very top surface is cartilage. Hyaline cartilage specifically, or articular cartilage if you want to call it just as a general class. Specially designed tissue, you've seen examples of this in lab. Smooth tissue that reduces friction. Also absorbs some impact, some compression and extension between bones as you load a structure or remove the load from a structure. With very little blood supply, these are the regions where if they wear down, they don't really get repaired. Where if you lose some cartilage between the bones, it's quite painful as you get older. Little to no blood supply, while the rest of the bone has significant blood supply. The cartilage itself does not. What else? You know the periosteum, the surrounding hard layer, the calcified, dense layer of the outer surface of the bone, the compact bone. The medullary cavity, which contains the marrow. It's the inside of the diaphysis. The inside with the marrow, lots of vasculature, some nerves running longitudinally as well. And it doesn't seem logical to hollow out a bone if the whole point is protection and rigidity and stability. But this really allows us to optimize the strength to weight ratio. You can hollow out the inner cylinder, hardly weaken the structure of the bone at all, longitudinally from end to end. But that hollow cavity really lightens the bone and allows easier movement, easier contraction and movement of joints. Of course, that applies largely to vertical loading. If you had an impact coming in perpendicular, it's a different story. But strength to weight ratio, very high from end to end vertically on this figure. Lastly, endosteum, the thin membrane lining the inside of the cavity, which we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on, but it's a part of the bone. That was inevitable, right? So major components of a long bone. Most of these you can see in other shaped bones as well. Some of them you obviously won't, and I'll highlight those as we get to those sections. But these are the important characteristics that you should know moving forward. Now these make up the structure of bone. The types of tissue, if you'll remember back to the histology section, are generally divided in two: compact bone, which you know very well, osteons, concentric rings, lacunae, all that good stuff. We'll show you an example, a recall slide coming up. And spongy bone, which is lightweight, not condensed, with few concentric rings. It's airy. It's like the inside of an Aero chocolate bar. Lots of space. Lightweight that provides support for the outer surface of bone. Usually connection points as well. The light, airy, open space is formed by pillars that we call trabeculae. And I'll point those out coming up. Trabeculae. So you can see these a little bit better on the next slide as we talk about blood and nervous supply. General, compact bone, the outside surface, spongy bone inside, allowing the chambers for the marrow to circulate and for blood supply to enter and exit. We see the same thing here. Notice the epiphyseal line, compact bone on the outside, spongy porous bone near the metaphysis and the epiphysis at the top. We have a few important characteristic arteries and veins, which should probably be reviewed as well. Very small perforating arteries, the parosteal arteries that supply the compact bone proper, the superficial surface of most long bones. Arteries and veins in virtually all cases, the majority of cases, will travel together. It's not always true, but they often travel together. Artery and vein, so periosteal artery and vein, supplying and then draining the outer compact bone. We have large nutrient arteries that enter into the medullary cavity, the central canal within the long bone, that perforate through the compact bone, through the spongy bone, all the way to the inside, and then send off tributaries to the rest of the bone tissue. Notice this is highly vascularized. Lots of blood supply. And these will anastomose or meet with complementary arteries and veins that come from the arterial supply of the joints. These are the epiphyseal arteries and veins. Notice these come from somewhere else. We don't really see where they come from, but there's usually fairly good arterial supply to the joints between bones. And some of those arteries will enter into the epiphyses and the metaphyses. That's the right way to say it. Never mind. I'm not going to go off on a tangent. So these come in and then meet the tributaries of the nutrient veins to supply the red marrow, to absorb and then send new red blood cells out to the rest of the circulation. This is how they're picked up and then transported in the plasma to the rest of the body. Highly vascularized. The only areas without significant vasculature are the surfaces on top of the epiphyses, the articular cartilage. The majority of the internal tissue supplied with arterial blood and then drained by venous blood. Also, everywhere you look and you see arteries and veins will often also supply nervous information. So you'll also have nervous information traveling with the arteries and veins that provide information on damage, stress, breakages, mostly sensory information, very little efferent information because bone doesn't need it so much. So let's talk about 5 minutes. Should we talk about formation? The process of formation? I'll tell you what. Tell me what these cells are. And if you tell me what they are, I'll know that you've reviewed enough, you have the familiar background enough that we can just continue and pick up tomorrow. We'll take off after you tell me what these 4 cells are. So heading from left to right, who wants to tell me what the cells are, what they do, what their main function is? You've seen this in lab before, should be review. Recall the histology of bone from way back when. Anyone want to chance it? What if I say osteoprogenitor? Does that mean anything? Well, it's also listed on the slide, isn't it? Osteogenic cell? What does it sound like it does? What do the arrows indicate that it does? Turns into something. Okay, fantastic. What does it turn into? Osteoblast. What does the osteoblast do? Builds. Osteoblasts build. They lay down the extracellular matrix. They help calcify bone. They build and accrue bone tissue. What do those become? Osteocytes, which don't build necessarily, but maintain. Fantastic. And then the complementary type of cell that doesn't originate from the bone lineage, but rather from the immune system is osteoclasts that do what?
Breaks down bone.
Breakdown. Fantastic. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you next week.